our sermon series on generations with a discussion about the millennials. Now, before I share with you about the millennials, I want to share with you an experience that I had last year. I attended a seminar about generations in the workplace. As you can tell, I really like this stuff. And when I got there, I noticed that there was a problem. They only were talking about 3 generations, which when you think about it is not so bad, because the 3 generations which are in the workplace right now, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the millennials, that's what they were talking about, and how you can work with each of the generations and how they can work with each other. And that was fine. It was a very good presentation. And afterwards, I went up to the presenter and I said to her, I said, I pastor a church, and I have 6 generations in the church that I serve. What kind of answers can you provide for me? How can I get my generations to work with each other and to understand each other? And she didn't have an answer for me yet, but she took my name and my email address and told me that she would get back to me. The presentation was last year, and I still have not heard from her. I think I scared her away. As we have talked about, we have members of this church that are part of the GI generation. That means that you are 95 years or older. We have members here in the silent generation. You are now retired fully. You're not in the workplace, but you're volunteering. We have baby boomers. Half of you are retired, half of you are thinking about retirement. And then we have the next generation, what are fully in the workforce, the Gen Xers and the millennials. And your issues, our issues, my issues, are especially when it comes to the church, is that we are busy. We're busy with our careers. We're busy with raising a family. We're busy taking care of parents and grandparents. We're busy with life. And then we have the youngest generation, which I'm just calling the kids and the youth. Talk about a varied group. Our goal in this sermon series is that we can understand each other. And more than that, understand how each of the generations plays a part and addresses church and spirituality. Now, before we get to the millennials, I want to talk about what I'm calling the kids and the youth. Unfortunately, you do not get a Sunday. I'm sorry, there just isn't enough information out there, enough research. And you don't even have a name yet. In fact, when you talk to this generation of kids and youth, they will give you about 4 or 5 different names. And I usually don't like to say a name until everyone kind of says, okay, we can all identify with this one generation of name. But you've been curious. I've had kids in this generation come up to me and say, okay, tell me some characteristics. So, born between 1998 and 2015. That's this generation. Now, the end date is kind of a guesstimate that many generational theorists are giving. But you think about it. If the end date is 2015, we have people in this church that are newborns to 4 years old that are part of another generation. That means we have 7 generations in one church. Okay, back to the children and youth. You are the first cohort where the internet was readily available. I love this quote. You have a digital bond to the internet. The image that comes to mind is of a kid coming out of the room clutching a phone in their hands. That's what comes to mind. And speaking of the phone, they consider it a rite of passage. When my wife and I take the phone away as a form of punishment from our children, my wife has said to me, she says, you realize you have just eliminated any connection with their friends and peers. That's what the phone is. That is how significant the phone is to this generation. Okay, this generation, as we talked about, is not in the workforce yet, but experts can already tell your spending habits. Statistics show that this generation is very debt-averse. They choose debit cards over credit cards. David Ramsey has already noted this. They do not want to be coupled with the college debt that is crippling the millennial generation. And speaking of the economy, they want it on demand. That means when they make a purchase, usually on their phone, they want to be able to track it. They want to be able to see exactly where that product is when it gets on their door, or they can have it on their phone almost immediately. And equality is really important to this generation. there is an overwhelming majority support same-sex marriage, transgender rights, and gender equality. And one more thing, this generation can multitask. They can have the TV on, they can follow something on a laptop, they can have a conversation on their phone, they can play a video game, and they can probably all drive all at the same time. Okay, enough about the generation that doesn't have a name. Let's look at today's millennials. You're a millennial if you were born between 1982 and 1998. Your generation grew up in a time when children were especially valued by your parents, by the parents. You are a reaction against what Generation X went through. And I hope you're catching a theme there. It's why each generation is different. Each generation is a reaction against the excess of the previous generation. And this is going to become a little apparent later on. People who are raising millennial kids, and that includes late baby boomers and Gen Xers, have shown more anxiety and more concern about parenting than anyone has for decades. Interesting. And the reason for this is this quote: "The standards of a well-raised child keep escalating." There's a lot of pressure. And it's not just parents who are anxious. Many millennials report raised feelings of anxiety. And the coming of age. Now we turn to the coming of age. And as we talked about, each generation has this. We don't quite know what that coming of age is going to be for our children and youth, but every millennial can tell you exactly where they were when what happened? 9/11. Exactly. And that pretty much is the cutoff. If you can't remember 9/11, then you were not part of the millennial generation. One expert said of the coming of age, "They came of age during the War on Terror, a nasty recession, skyrocketing student debt, and an accelerated information age." Now, what does this mean? The Washington Post had a really good article, and they said this: "The percentage of young people married and living on their own has dropped by more than 50% since the 1960s. Interesting. 50%. It's not just with homes. Millennials have been reluctant to buy items such as cars, music, and luxury goods. Instead, they're turning to a new set of services that provide access to products without the burdens of ownership, giving rise to what's being called a shared economy." Millennials are living under this burden of a lot of student debt and entering into an economy that is not providing much in great and good wages. Now remember, I said that each generation is a reaction against the previous excesses of the generation. I can't speak for certain what's going to happen with the children and youth, but I have some ideas about how their reaction is going to be as they're moving forward. So that means that for millennials, many of them are moving closer to family, and many of them are moving in with their family. And when it comes to community, they have a strong sense of civic mindedness and social responsibility. And I certainly saw, we saw this with the Gen Xers, but millennials kind of take it up to the next step. They bond together. They want to make a difference, and they do it through team building. And I came across this in your questionnaires. Millennials said to me in the questionnaires that they like doing stuff together as a group, as a community. This was vitally important, as one person put it. Now, we probably have noticed this, that each generation comments about this, that they like to do things together, but one thing that we've noticed that's a little bit different with the millennials is they're much more willing to cross generational lines. One person wrote, "If church feels like a family, we're much more willing to participate." And speaking of community and spirituality, here was an interesting response. More than a third of us are the nuns. And when I mean nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Nuns meaning we hold no religious identity, but we long for community. It might be lifting weights and climbing ropes 5 mornings a week at places like CrossFit. And if you have a friend involved in CrossFit, you will know how evangelical that community is. Each of these communities and others like them shape participants' worldviews, ethics, and behaviors. And in a culture where many are hungry for connection, these communities offer the experience of being part of something bigger than ourselves. What some might describe as experiencing the divine. experiencing the divine. I think that's a good segue. Did you get that segue? That's a millennial product. That's a good segue into looking at our scripture that I think describes a millennial. Sue?
Scripture this morning is Matthew 26:31 through 46, the judgment of the nations. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people, one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation for the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to eat? And when was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it unto me." Then he will say to those on the left hand, "You are accursed. Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared by the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do this to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into the eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. May the Lord add blessing to the scripture.
Thank you, sir. What becomes apparent from this lesson from Jesus is that he recognizes a problem and he demands to do something about it now. No waiting to take this to committee. No talking to a task force. This is a generational group that sees a problem, talks about it on social media, and is ready for action. I call that uncompromising determination. Reminds me of a story. It was about a farmer who sees a sign as he's driving down the road that says, "Experience the thrill of flying." And he thinks to himself, "Hey, my wife is having a birthday tomorrow. She would love to fly." So he drives into the airport and he finds a pilot who's got one of those open cab planes. And he's talking to the pilot and about taking his wife for her birthday, the thrill of flying. And the pilot agrees. He says, "Okay, I'll take you up. I'll show you the farm." And then he tells him the price. And then the farmer says, whoa, that's way too high. And thus begins the bartering process. And this goes on for a while until finally the pilot agrees to the lower price on one condition. He says, "Okay, all right, I will agree to lower condition, but you can't say a word. You and your wife cannot utter one sound, no whimper, nothing at all. You say anything, make a sound, and the price goes back up to the original condition." The farmer agrees to it. Sounds like a pretty good plan. So the next day, the three of them get into the plane that takes off, and the farmer's thinking to himself, "Hey, if I do some roller coaster dips, turns of the plane, take it upside down, I know that I can get him to say something." And so that's what he does. Dips and turns and climbs and dives and loop-de-loops, but not a sound. Nothing is uttered from the two behind him. They are absolutely silent. And then the plane lands. And the pilot yells back at the farmer and his wife. He says, I can't believe you did not say anything up there. I dipped and turned and climbed and dived like never before, but you two were quiet the whole time. I guess you win. And then the farmer shouts back, well, you almost won, son. You almost won. I felt like hollering when my wife fell out back there. I mean, just think what the millennials have been able to accomplish in a short amount of time. Occupy Wall Street. They almost single-handedly elected Bernie Sanders to the Democratic nomination. And who led the fight for equal rights at our special session about the United Methodist Church? It was the millennials. One observer wrote, millennials look at their elders and see folks in touch with their feelings who can't make anything work. Now, doesn't that sound like a message from Jesus? A few weeks ago, I told you that I believe that Jesus would make a really good baby boomer. I think in today's message, we have a millennial in the making. Chuck Wall, like Jesus, is not a millennial, but he's a teacher. He works with them. And he knows that this is a group on the edge of doing something significant. Now, Chuck Wall is an instructor at Bakersfield College in California. And one day he was watching the news. And this phrase kind of stuck with him from the broadcaster. Another random act of senseless violence. And so he had an idea. He was going to give his students an assignment, an unusual assignment. They were to do something out of the ordinary and write an essay about it. Well, as a group, they came up with a bumper sticker that said, today I will commit one random act of senseless kindness. Will you? And then they sold the stickers and gave the profits to a county Braille center. And then the essays went beyond the stickers. One said that he paid his mother's utility bills. Another student said that he bought 30 blankets at a Salvation Army and gave it to the homeless that were living under the bridge. One put stickers on all 113 county patrol cars. And in one essay it wrote, I had no idea our community was in such need of something so positive. That really echoes, I think, the questionnaires that you filled out in this generation. Val wrote in hers, lately all my churches have emphasized family. I have been on the receiving side of this lately. And another said, the church is changing for the good by being more open to outsiders. However, these questionnaires also identify the problem that needs to be addressed. One person wrote, as a single person, it's hard to feel like I fit in because there are almost no gatherings for single young folks. And another was just more blunt. The church has not adjusted with the times. And they were talking about homosexuality. And I think we found the characteristic of a millennial. They are blunt. And rightfully so. They're facing economic challenges, not to mention a planet that is reeling with global warming. They can easily identify a problem and are ready to tackle it now. And it comes across in their spirituality. We're going to watch a video here. And you're probably thinking, we're going to watch a video here. And you might think, well, this is pretty cliche, watching a video about the millennials. But if you think about it, the millennials know technology, and they really expect the church to at least embrace some type of technology. Now, you might be familiar with this clip because it is the most watched religious clip on the internet today. In fact, this one video has been viewed 34 million times. Go ahead. Two videos playing at the same time.
Jesus, Republican really wasn't his mission. What if I told you Republican doesn't automatically mean Christian, and just because you
you. Thank you.
What if I told you Jesus came to abolish religion? What if I told you voting Republican really wasn't his mission? What if I told you Republican doesn't automatically mean Christian, and just because you call some people blind doesn't automatically give you vision? I mean, if religion is so great, why has it started so many wars? Why does it build huge churches but fails to feed the poor? Tell single moms God doesn't love them if they've ever had a divorce, but in the Old Testament, God actually calls religious people whores. Religion might preach grace, but another thing they practice. To ridicule God's people, they did it to John the Baptist. They can't fix their problems, and so they just mask it, not realizing religion's like spraying perfume on a casket. See, the problem with religion is it never gets to the core. It's just behavior modification, like a long list of chores. Like, let's dress up the outside, make it look nice and neat. But it's funny, that's what they used to do to mummies while the corpse rots underneath. Now, I ain't judging. I'm just saying, quit putting on a fake look. Because there's a problem if people only know that you're a Christian by your Facebook. I mean, in every other aspect of life, you know that logic's unworthy. It's like saying you play for the Lakers just because you bought a jersey. See, this was me too, but no one seemed to be on to me. Acting like a church kid while addicted to pornography. See, on Sunday I'd go to church, but Saturday getting faded, acting if I was simply created to just have sex and get wasted. See, I spent my whole life building this facade of neatness, but now that I know Jesus, I boast in my weakness. Because if grace is water, then the church should be an ocean. It's not a museum for good people, it's a hospital for the broken. Which means I don't have to hide my failure, I don't have to hide my sin. Because it doesn't depend on me, it depends on him. See, because when I was God's enemy, and certainly not a fan, he looked down and said, I want that man. Which is why Jesus hated religion, and for it he called them fools. Don't you see so much better than just following some rules? Now let me clarify. I love the church, I love the Bible, and yes, I believe in sin. But if Jesus came to your church, would they actually let him in? See, remember he was called a glutton and a drunkard by religious men. But the Son of God never supports self-righteousness, not now, not then. Now back to the point, one thing is vital to mention. How Jesus and religion are on opposite spectrums. See, one's the work of God, but one's a man-made invention. See, one is the cure, but the other's the infection. See, because religion says do. Jesus says done. Religion says slave. Jesus says son. Religion puts you in bondage, while Jesus sets you free. Religion makes you blind, but Jesus makes you see. And that's why religion and Jesus are two different clans. Religion is man searching for God. Christianity is God searching for man. Which is why salvation is freely mine, and forgiveness is my own. Not based on my merits, but Jesus' obedience alone. Because he took the crown of thorns and the blood dripped down his face. He took what we all deserve. I guess that's why you call it grace. And while being murdered, he yelled, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Because when he was dangling on that cross, he was thinking of you. And he absorbed all your sin, and he buried it in the tomb, which is why I'm kneeling at the cross saying, come on, there's room. So for religion, no, I hate it. In fact, I literally resent it. Because when Jesus said, it is finished, I believe he meant it.
Recently, we lost a giant in the world of religion. Her name, Roger, would you be able to move that on to the next slide there? There's a picture of Rachel Ward Evans. She passed away. She was only in her 30s. But she redefined religion for so many. In fact, her essay on Millennials returning to the church has been read by tens of thousands of millennials and people of all generations. This week, I was attending a continuing ed event, and the quote that I'm about to share from Rachel was used in that closing devotion. I believe it represents everything that a millennial stands for. and demands in their spirituality and in the church. As you listen to these words and as you read them, I want you to think about what Jesus says in the gospel. Roger, would you be willing to extend that on to the next slide? Rather than wearing out my voice in calling for an end to evangelicalism's culture wars, I think it's time to focus on finding and creating church among its many refugees. Women called to ministry, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, science lovers, doubters, dreamers, misfits, abuse survivors, those who refuse to choose between their intellectual integrity and their faith, or their compassion and their religion, those who have, for whatever reason, been farewelled. Instead of fighting for a seat at the evangelical table, I want to prepare tables in the wilderness where everyone is welcome and where we can go on discussing and debating the Bible, science, sexuality, gender, racial reconciliation, justice, church, and faith, but without labels, without wars. Jesus is blunt, and so are the millennials. They recognize what is wrong with society, they present a solution, and then they demand that we all get it, and then we do it. Doesn't that sound like the kingdom of God? I think the church is in good hands.